On this edition of the Lynch List, I'm going to be ranking Islam Makhachev's toughest UFC opponents, and we're going to do a top 10 for this. Islam's actually fought 14 fighters in the UFC so far, and as far as a criteria, there's a couple different ways you can go with this one. I am going with what did that fighter do at that point in their career when they fought Islam, sort of leading into the fight? How old was the fighter when they fought Islam? I think that's a key detail as well. And what did they do after? You know, how did that win age, so to speak, as Islam defeated them or didn't defeat them, although he only has one loss, but that's how we're going to use that for a criteria. So at the time of recording this, Islam is slated to fight Charles Oliveira in a rematch at UFC 294 in the main event for the lightweight title. Of course, Islam is the champion right now, so just wanted to use that as sort of a reference point. And rather than start with number 10, I'm going to talk about who didn't make the top 10 list. We'll start there first and work our way up here, and hopefully you guys can give me some good opinions after this. I know this isn't going to be, not everyone's going to agree, but that's why we do these lists in the first place. So some of the fighters that did not make this list, let's start first with the guy that Islam fought in his UFC debut, which was Leo Kuntz. Leo Kuntz, you can see there, lost to Islam by rear naked choke. Leo Kuntz actually fought Islam when he was 31 at the time. I hadn't really done much. Actually, I think people forget Leo Kuntz was on The Ultimate Fighter, actually got knocked out by Sam Alvey. After he fought Islam, he's only fought 4 times and he went 2-2. Didn't really do much in his career. I don't think he cracks his top 10 in my opinion. If you disagree, would like to hear you in the comments. Okay, the other win that the other fighter I should say that is not going to make this top 10 list is a Canadian guy, actually, Cajun Johnson. A little bit of a backstory with this one as well. So Islam fights Cajun Johnson in his fight at UFC on Fox 30, which was actually in Calgary. This was on the undercard, believe it or not. This was on the Alvarez-Poirier 2 card. Cajun Johnson, was basically being punished by the UFC. He was outspoken on fighter pay, and I think it was the UFC's way of saying, okay, you're going to, talk loudly about fighter pay and complain about it. We're going to give you this absolute killer in Islam Makhachev. So, of course, Islam finishing him in the first round. So at the time, Cajun Johnson was 34 years old and had a bit of a weird UFC career. If you remember, he was on The Ultimate Fighter and kind of had these not fluky wins, but wins that were just, very interesting, right? So he has the loss in his debut, and then he ends up getting a win after that. And he had a couple of these weird wins, like the Martins win, for example. He finished him in the 3rd round. That was a fight that he was losing. He defeats Stevie Ray by split decision. So there was it was like a weird winning streak that Cajun had. And I think my sense anyways at the time was that the UFC was trying to get rid of Cajun Johnson. That's why they gave him Islam Makhachev and then gave him Rustam Havilov after that. So unfortunately, Cajun Johnson does not make this list because he basically had one more fight after Islam, and then even leading into that, not a lot of great stuff going on in terms of some of the fights. He actually fought Rory McDonald, got finished in that fight too. So yeah, unfortunately, Cajun Johnson does not make this list. There's just 2 other names we're going to go through here. I'm not going to spend too much time because I know you guys want to get to the actual list here. Unfortunately, Gleison Tibau did not make this list. Now, I know some people will be surprised by this, but if you look at this fight, Gleison Tibau was 34 years old at the time. Sort of leading into the fight, he actually he was on a 2-fight losing streak. Now, one of them wasn't really a loss. He ended up getting busted for PEDs. You can see a failed drug test here. He actually won that fight over Abel Trujillo, but it was overturned. But kind of the point I was getting at is that Gleison Tibau was kind of on the downswing of his career, so to speak. And, again, Tony Ferguson finished him in the very first round, just a few fights prior to that. He wasn't getting the same Gleison Tibau, for example, that fought Khabib Nurmagomedov. So while Gleison has had an interesting career, he certainly fought sort of the who's who. He's been in the UFC for a while, had a win over Rafael dos Anjos. I can't really put him on this top 10 just because at the time we weren't getting the prime Gleison Tibau, in my opinion. So he does not make the list. And then one other name as well, a bit of a veteran fight as well, is Nick Lentz. Nick Lentz does not make our list either. Nick Lentz was 32 at the time, but he fought 6 times at lightweight. I know he fought more at 6 times at featherweight, not lightweight. He fought, again, he had Nick Lentz's most of his success came at 145. It didn't come at 155. So right there, you got a guy in Islam who, is a lightweight. I think Lentz was better suited at featherweight, and Lentz really didn't have a lot of really great wins at featherweight either. He had the Charles Oliveira. Actually, people forget he had that rivalry with Oliveira where he had the no contest, and then they fought again, and he ended up losing. And yeah, I mean, he just didn't have a lot of quality wins. And then even after the Islam fight, had a decent career, but ended up losing a lot of fights. Granted, he fought a lot of really good guys, David Tamer, Charles Oliveira, Arnold Allen, etc. But yeah, unfortunately, Lentz does not make this list. Okay, let's get into the top 10. And I'm going to start with who I have at number 10. And this may surprise some people, but I'm actually going with Chris Wade here. Now, Chris Wade, for most of you watching, will know him from PFL, but Chris Wade actually had a pretty tough go in the UFC prior to that. And Chris Wade was 28 years old at the time he fought Islam. So Chris Wade wasn't even in the prime of his career. He was just getting there. And again, lost to Rustam Habibov in the fight previous to that. And if you guys remember, Rustam Habibov had a pretty successful UFC career for the most part. Sorry, I'm just trying to get on where he is here. Looking for him. Chris Wade, there we go. So Chris Wade was 11-2 at the time. Still a lot of promise in terms of what he was able to do. And, you look at it since then, Chris Wade has actually gone 12-6 since then. And granted, a lot of these wins are in most of the wins are in PFL since, but there's some decent opponents in there. I think Chris Wade is actually a pretty good fighter. And like I said, because he was young at the time, I kind of think there was, Islam didn't get the prime Chris Wade at the time when he was fighting him. He was getting sort of the Chris Wade that was just on the cusp of being something great. So I put Chris Wade in the top 10 because I do think of him highly as some of the other fighters. And like I mentioned, when Islam fought him, he was 11-2 at the time, or sorry, 11-1, I guess. 11-2 ended up losing that one. So Chris Wade was a good opponent at the time for Islam Makhachev. Okay, next fighter we're going to look at here. Adriano Martins, the only man to defeat Islam Makhachev. Where's Martins here? I got to find him. Right there, Adriano Martins. Now, Martins is not on this list necessarily because he defeated Islam. I'm pretty sure if Islam and Adriano Martins fought 9 out of 10 times, Martins probably losing that fight. But if you go look in his career a little bit after this, right, Adriano Martins, 32 at the time, defeated Rustam Habibov the fight previous to that, right? Where is it here? That was a big win at the time. Habibov was 17-2, had a decent career. Darren Cruikshank finished him. Did lose to Cerrone. That was sort of the only blemish at that point, but had a decent career leading into this fight. And then even after that, like I said, he was beating Cajun Johnson. Probably should have won that one. The wins after didn't necessarily age too well, but I think he sort of takes the nod on here in terms of opponents because, again, you could argue that Martins was in the prime of his career. And like I said, he had that big win over Habibov. I guess sort of the big reason I have Martins on here is two reasons. Number one, he defeated Islam, so he kind of has to be on this top 10 list. And number two, he was 32 at the time, so he was right in the prime of his career, in my opinion. So Adriano Martins has to get in there as well. And the other fight I should mention with Adriano Martins, he fought Leo Santos after that. I actually thought he won that fight. It was a split decision loss. Santos was 15-3-1 at the time. So, again, I think Martins belongs on here just because he does have the win over Islam. Okay, let's go to number 8. And this one, some people may have ranked higher. I don't. Where is he here? Davy Ramos. Okay, so when Davy Ramos fought Islam at the time, Davy Ramos was, where are we here? Davy Ramos was 32 years old. But prior to that, he had not fought great competition. If you kind of look at the resume and who he's fought, his 2 UFC wins leading into this fight were John Gunther. You guys remember him, the kind of the crazy guy that was on The Ultimate Fighter, and then Austin Hubbard, who ended up getting cut shortly after that. So there weren't great wins. There weren't any great wins outside the UFC at the time. Ramos was 32, so that was kind of the prime of his career. And then even after that, Davy Ramos didn't really go on to do like really amazing things when he lost to Islam. Right. So if you look at it after the fact, Davy Ramos would go on to, lose a couple fights after that. He ended up actually, I believe he got cut after that fight, lost to Arman. Now, granted, Arman's a very good opponent, but then, hadn't done much, lost an ACA, is coming off a win in his last fight. But I just don't think Ramos is that great. Now, I know people will point to the fact that he's an ADCC gold medalist in terms of jiu-jitsu. That's great, but you got to be able to utilize that in MMA a lot. And we didn't really get to see that. So I just think with Davy Ramos, again, for me, he gets the number 8 spot. I know people will have him higher. We didn't get to see a lot of him in terms of what he was able to do in the UFC. So he's in my number 8 spot. Okay, number 7. We're going to go with a guy that Islam Makhachev finished. He finished a lot of opponents, but that's Drew Dober. Now, Drew Dober's been a bit of a veteran. He's been in and out of, some really good fights throughout his UFC career. Let's go have a quick look at Drew Dober. And if you look at Drew Dober here, still not that old. He was how old? He was 32 at the time he fought Islam. He had a full camp for this one. There's like no excuses or anything like that. And prior to that, he had a couple key losses. He had lost to, Olivier. He had lost to Beneil Dariush. Although, Olivier ended up being a PFL champ later on. But yeah, ends up losing to him. And then he lost to Brad Riddell, but he had a couple nice wins. Terrence McKinney, Rafael Alves, Bobby Green was a great win. One of the few guys to knock out Bobby Green in the UFC. So that's got to count for something. And I know he's coming off a loss in his last fight, but Drew Dober's a veteran. He was a good opponent at the time. He was, like I said, a guy who was dangerous, had the knockout power. Drew Dober gets the number 7 spot for me. Okay, next fighter on the list that makes the number 6 spot is going to be Thiago Moises. Now, with Thiago, it's kind of one of those, I think there's still some potential here. I'm kind of banking on that a little bit. So Thiago Moises was 26 at the time that he fought Islam Makhachev. But here's one of the key things in the fight with Thiago Moises and Islam Makhachev. Thiago Moises went to the 4th round with him. Not a lot of fighters do that, right? Now, I think Thiago's very well-rounded. You know, he could even be higher on this list. I wouldn't have an issue with that. I still don't think at the time, you know, he was 26 at the time. Right now, Thiago Moises is how old? I think he's still under 30, if I'm not mistaken. I just think there's some potential here with Thiago. So maybe not as green as you'd like. He's 28 years old. So that was only 2 years ago he lost that fight. I just think the fact that he went 4 rounds with him, the fact that in those earlier rounds, like Islam was winning, I don't think there was any round that Thiago Moises won, but he made it close. I think from that standpoint, he was a tougher opponent for Islam. So he's got to go there just for the simple fact he went 4 rounds with Islam. I'm putting him there in the number 6 spot. Okay, let's get to number 5. And again, I can understand people having Moises higher than some of the other names on here because of that potential. I don't have an issue with that. Number 5 for me is Dan Hooker. Okay, Dan Hooker, I know a bit of a controversial guy with all the stuff that he said in the media and everything, but take all that aside. Dan Hooker's had a very interesting career, right? So Dan Hooker was 31 at the time. His best win to date since fighting Islam and even to this day is probably the win over Paul Felder. But that Paul Felder fight is a fight that I think a lot of people felt like should have gone the other way. I remember thinking Felder won that fight. So if you go outside of that, his best win is probably Al Iaquinta. And he's had a bit of an up and down career. Got finished by actually got absolutely dominated against Edson Barbosa at that point. Now he has the win over Gilbert Burns. I know people will bring that up. I still maintain this. I think Burns had such a tough weight cut that anyone who was in there with him that had any sort of knockout power was going to knock him out. So you could count the Burns win, but that was the last fight that Burns had at lightweight, and he moved up and he's been at welterweight ever since. So that's kind of how I'm looking at that. The thing with Hooker, and maybe why I'm putting him here a bit higher than maybe like a Thiago Moises and stuff, is because he's fought really good opposition throughout his career. I mean, look at some of these names here. Miller, Burns, even Yair Rodriguez. He's fought, Iaquinta, Felder, Dustin Poirier, Chandler. Like he's fought Allen. And that was one of the reasons why I thought that he had a chance against Jalen Turner, and he ended up beating him. And again, Turner's a good win. That's a nice victory, especially considering what had happened there. The reason Dan Hooker is in the spot is because and I cut him a little bit of slack, is that was a short notice fight for Hooker. He didn't have much of a training camp. It was during, I believe it was during COVID. Actually, when was that fight? Yeah, 2021. There's all the COVID stuff. He couldn't go, do a proper training camp. I think if he had a full training camp, he's still losing to Islam, but still, I think you got to give Hooker some respect and put him here in the number 5 spot. Okay, let's get to number 4. This might surprise some people. I have Bobby Green over Dan Hooker. So a couple of reasons for that. Bobby Green was, by the way, Dan Hooker was 31 when he fought Islam. I don't know if I mentioned that or not. Okay, so here's the thing. Bobby Green was 35 at the time of fighting Islam, but the thing with Bobby Green is he's a tough guy to finish, at least in the UFC. You have to go all the way back to 2016, the last time Bobby Green had a stoppage loss prior to him fighting Islam. And he's got some good wins. For example, I think people forget that Bobby Green has a win over Josh Thompson, which at the time was very good. Josh Thompson, a former title challenger, someone that, was doing quite well since coming over from Strikeforce. That was a big win for him back then. Did quite well. And like I said, even his losses, a lot of these were decisions, right? Rashid Magomedov, Jakar Close and all that. I know some of these losses haven't aged so well. I know Thiago Moises has beat him as well, a couple fights before, but that was a close fight that maybe could have gone the other way. Fiziev, that was a tough opponent there too. I might be ranking Bobby Green a little bit high. I know people might disagree here, but Bobby's a veteran. Like basically what I'm trying to say is that Bobby also had a short camp for this fight, but the thing is, he's a tough guy to take out. And the fact that Islam finished him in the first round, I think is extremely impressive. And I think that, Bobby Green had durability on his side. So that was a bit of a risk going into the fight. And Bobby Green is also a very good striker as well, too. So I think overall, Green's had the better career than Dan Hooker. That's why I gave him the edge there. I know Thiago Moises has a win over him, but if you look at the overall body of work, Bobby Green earns this spot, in my opinion, over Thiago Moises. So Green is going to come in at number 4. Now, the top 3 here, I don't think will surprise many people. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think it's pretty obvious as far as who I'm going with. Going in at number 3, is Arman Tsarukyan. Now, people may have him at number 2, and I certainly think with the way Arman's going, he could certainly end up being number 2 at some point. But to this point, you have to look at the fact that Arman Tsarukyan, and we'll get to him here in a second, Arman just doesn't have a lot of great wins if you look at sort of who he's defeated and everything like that. That's why he's not higher on this list. But I think the potential's there. I've said this before. I think this is a guy that could potentially be a UFC champion with the skill set he has. The thing for me that I'm kind of banking on with Arman as well, is that I think this guy's a really special fighter. I think he does things in fights that you don't see other fighters do, from his movement to his, just so many different things that he's very, very, very good at, and he's very well rounded. And here's the crazy thing, guys. I had to go back and check this. Arman was 22 years old when he fought Islam on short notice, and he went the distance. That in itself, he's one of the few guys to go to the judges' scorecards with Islam. He took it on short notice, and he's 22. To me, that outweighs so many other opponents that Islam's fought, and that's why he has to be in the number 3 spot for me. Again, people might think this is kind of high, but I think Arman belongs in number 3, and I think there is potential for him to move up even more as he continues his career here. Now, I thought he beat Mateusz Gamrot as far as the things he's done after his career, but I thought he beat Gamrot there. Joel Alvarez is a very good win. Ismagulov's a good win. Joaquim Silva, people are going to nitpick, oh, he got dropped in that fight. Whatever. He won the fight. He dominated the whole time. And I think whoever he fights next, hopefully it's a big name opponent. But I really think that Arman is the future of this division. So Arman for me is number 3, and I have to put him there. Absolutely. Okay, let's get to number 2. And it's got to be Charles Oliveira. And obviously Oliveira going to have that rematch against Islam coming up here at UFC 294, but the body of work speaks for itself. Don't need to mention too much. Charles was 33 at the time he fought Islam. Charles Oliveira, look at this resume prior to fighting Islam. I mean, it is one of the best resumes in the lightweight division history. I'm sorry, I will say that. That is a very good resume coming into this. Look at this. Chandler, Poirier, Gaethje, all stoppage wins. Extremely impressive. I know people think that Chandler's overrated, whatever. He had a good body of work in Bellator. He was a Bellator champ. Couldn't finish Ferguson, but absolutely dominated him as well. Finished Kevin Lee. That was the beginning of the end for Kevin Lee's career. I mean, Oliveira is honestly a very interesting story. He was considered a bust. He turned his career around. So there's a ton of momentum on Oliveira's side going into that fight. And he's dangerous everywhere. And even after the loss to Islam, where he got completely outclassed. And, again, people will look at the performance and say, how can you put him at number 2 when, it ended up being one of Islam's easiest wins? He had an off night. Fighters have it. It's going to happen every now and then. You'll see one fighter just have a performance that doesn't, that isn't up to par. But he goes out there the next fight, and he finishes Beneil Dariush in the first round. Extremely impressive. Dariush had not been finished since the Alex Hernandez fight, right? You have to go all the way. When was that Hernandez loss that Dariush had? That was way back in 2018. That was a very big win for Charles. So that's why for me, he's number 2. You can't ignore the fact that he won the lightweight title. He had defeated a number of good opponents, including Poirier, Gaethje, Chandler. He's got to be number 2. Again, I know the performance itself didn't look that tough for Islam, but going in, Charles very much had a strong case, in my opinion, to win that fight. And I know I got a lot of flack for it, but whatever. I wasn't the only one who picked Charles going into that fight. So Oliveira gets number 2. And obviously at number 1, we got to go Alex Volkanovski. Volkanovski is going to go down as one of the greatest fighters of all time. That is one thing he has over most of these fighters on this list. Not to mention the fact he gave Islam the toughest fight he's had in his UFC career. And yes, I say that over Adriano Martins because, like I said, I don't want to say it was lucky, but Adriano Martins 9 times out of 10 is not beating Islam. Alex Volkanovski fighting Islam Makhachev, he might have a close fight every time. He might beat him. We don't know. We'll see. But I mean, the work speaks for itself. 3 wins over Max Holloway. I know it's a different weight class, but still, that's extremely impressive. Like, no one's defeated him at featherweight at this point. He just defeated Yair Rodriguez since the Islam fight. When people think maybe Volk's lost a step after losing the fight to Islam, he goes out there and puts on the type of performance we saw against a really good opponent in Yair Rodriguez. I mean, that's hard to ignore. And I know I kind of I'm kind of using the argument against myself because I talk about Nick Lentz being a featherweight, but still, you can't ignore that. Volk, 2 losses in his entire career, nearly beat Islam in his last fight, extremely close fight. He's got to be number 1 on this list. So that's kind of where I'm going with this list. And we'll just do a quick recap here. So at number 1, we got Alexander Volkanovski. Number 2, we have Charles Oliveira. Number 3, Arman Tsarukyan. Number 4, Bobby Green. Number 5, Dan Hooker. Number 6, Thiago Moises. Number 7, Drew Dober. Number 8, Davey Ramos. Number 9, Adriano Martins. And number 10, Chris Wade. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to, or what's your list? Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here, but you kind of get where I'm going with this. How would your top 10 look? I'm very curious about this. I know there's a couple here, like I mentioned, towards the 10, 9, 8, 7 that you could probably flip around a little bit, but I just, like I said, went with the age of the fighter fought, what they had done in their career at that point, and what type of fight they gave Islam. So that's kind of how I base this list. If there's any other fighters you want me to do toughest lists for, more than happy to hear your feedback here if there's any other fighters you want me to do. But like I said, Islam was one that was requested. I got it done, so that's where we are. I'm James Lynch. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @Lynch on Sports. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.